Hello to also to the folks attending online. My name is Darren, for those who don't know me, nursery manager here, and I wanted to talk today about growing garlic and onions, some excellent crops to work with, and it's a timely topic for the season. I know we're going to have a few people come in late, aware of that. Just bear with us as the doors open and close, and we'll just keep moving along. So, garlic and onions are excellent crops, high yield crops, um, and they tend to have generally a good success rate. Okay. So that makes them a fun introduction to overwinter gardening, things that you plant the summer or fall before for harvest the following summer, or biennial crops, in other words. Because they're an excellent introduction to that because you'll have good years with your onion and garlic crop. You'll have bad years with your onion crop, but unless you're doing something really, really, really wrong, you seldom have complete crop failures. You have some success, so it kind of builds up the confidence for growing stuff over the winter. They're super cold hardy. They're by our standards. We talk about Midwest. It's a little different game, of course. They're easy to grow relatively. They do have some specific needs, but they're not hard needs to meet. They're dense yield crops, so it doesn't take a huge amount of square footage to get actually substantial amounts of productivity. Some, though not all, also provide for long-term storage. So we have the ability to grow some crops, harvest a big batch of them all out at once, and then put them in storage and eat them for the rest of the year, hopefully until the next crop is ready, though it never quite seems to work out that way in my larder. So these are the alliums that are the bulb-forming alliums. We're going to just barely mention shallots in the interest of keeping this class down to a manageable size. We're talking heavily about garlic and onions rather than other bulb alliums. So one of the things that makes allium crops different, they are regulated by day length, by how long your light periods are in the daytime, not by how long they've been in the ground. So if you plant a tomato plant, you say it's a 90-day tomato plant. Well, it's 90 days from roughly from seed and their degree days and all that, but it's pretty consistent. You plant, if you can get it in the ground in April, it's 90 days from there. If you don't get it in the ground until July, it's 90 days from there. Onions and garlic aren't that way. They regulate by day length. So typically they'll have consistent harvest periods and you have options for different planting times. And that will impact your yield, but it doesn't change when they harvest. They're always ready at basically the same time. Because of that, they are usually planted as in our climate as a fall planted crop, grown over the winter for harvest the following summer. That maximizes your potential growing season and thus your yield. In colder climates, they have to spring start them. That does impact the yield some. One of the things that people underrate in alliums is their nutritional needs. They are surprisingly hungry plants. They look like these little things as far as their soil profile with these kind of grass-like foliage. You think, oh, that's not a very needy crop, but they are hungry, particularly of nitrogen. They need a substantial amount of nitrogen to do well, so feed them well. The alliums are pretty darn adaptable to anything but the worst soil qualities, but because they're an overwinter crop, you do need to pay attention to a couple of things. You need to pay attention to your soil drainage. We are wet all winter. In my little garden out northeast Corvallis, that means parts of the garden are often briefly underwater in the winter, and that's too wet for onion and garlic growing. So I have to plant on the slightly upper areas of the garden where it doesn't get quite as wet, so they don't completely drown out or rot away. The other thing is, again, growing over the winter, paying attention to your sun angles. So I've got a 6-foot fence around my little urban garden, and a 6-foot wooden fence. And there's a whole section of it that I can't garden in the summer because right up against the fence gets no light. But in the winter, that area is out here. It's 4 feet from that fence because the sun is so low on that southern horizon that I don't get any substantial amount of light in that strip. And that's something that when you're planting in September or early October, you got to account for. The sun's still heading downward, and you got to watch how close you are to your shadow patterns. So we'll start off into garlic. Garlic's a pretty consistent crop, pretty easy crop. Normal planting method for garlic is to plant September, October, maybe November, for growing over the winter. You have some options. You can plant clear up all winter long if you're not too muddy out there to plant. You can theoretically continue to plant garlic all the way up to the end of February or very early March and still get a crop. Past that, it's not usually worth doing. The later you plant, the smaller your harvest is going to be. There's a lot of fun varieties to choose from and just a good general fun crop to work with. So selection is usually best in the early part of the season. So like our garlic plants, our seed garlic for planting, our garlic bulbs for planting, came in about 3 weeks ago. Late September is pretty typical. And the sooner you get them in, of course, the better your yield as well. When you're looking to select bulbs, you want bulbs that have still a pretty good paper covering over them. You can see the outer edge of the paper, and then when we'll separate them out, we'll be separating them out into individual cloves for planting. But if they're completely denuded of paper, they're more likely to get damaged in the course of planting or early growing stages. Not like no paper is, not like a little bit of paper missing is a horrible thing, but more paper is a good thing. So pick bulbs that are still pretty well papered. And it's really worth checking the bulbs when you pick them up. So you pick up a bulb and you kind of push around the edges and see. They should be quite firm. They can get a little bit of give, but if they're soft at pushing in, they've already either begun to sprout and are losing a lot of their stored energy, or they've begun to rot and they're not going to be plantable. So check the firmness of those. A little bit of sprouting, a little bit of sponginess is okay, especially late in the season. You do this in January, even sometimes December, you'll see a fair amount of sprout coming out of them in the bins, and that's okay. Think about your garlic needs and what you actually will make use of. Typically, a pound of garlic planted will result in something around 6, 7, maybe 8 pounds of garlic at harvest. A pound planted is about 20 to 25 row feet. So it's a fairly substantial amount. So basically 5 foot rows of that to get 7 or 8 pounds of yield. A pound of garlic is a pretty substantial amount of garlic for use, so bear that in mind. If you use it almost every meal, like some of us do, it doesn't go as long as you think it's going to. When we talk about garlic, we talk about a bulb of garlic is the entire mass, right? So that's typically how you buy them. But when you're planting the individual cloves, you're separating those out. Don't plant the whole thing all at once, or you will have very poor yield. You can get all kinds of complex with rocamboles and artichokes and all these named types of garlic. Broadly, there's 3 garlics to really know. There are hard-neck garlics. There's several individual subcategories, but hard-neck garlics typically have a rich and complex flavor, but a short storage life. Soft-neck garlics, on the other hand, have really high yields because there's a lot more bulb to them. There's not a center mass missing. And they typically are very long stored. A lot of them still have quite good flavor, but they'll store for months and months and months, theoretically as much as 8 to 10 months in storage post-harvest. And then elephant garlic are massive, but they're really, really mild. I don't grow a lot of elephant garlic myself because I like the traditional bite of garlic. But in terms of yield, elephant garlic is amazing because of the clove size. They don't store quite as well as some of the soft necks, but close. They've got pretty good storage life all in all. So one of the terms we use, soft neck and hard neck. A hard neck garlic has a central floret stem, a flower stem that came up through the lobes, and the cloves are arrayed around that hard stem. And you push down, that's a very hard, woody stem at this point in time. And when you break that hard stem garlic open, you have a batch of fairly uniform, usually fairly large cloves, and they're all arrayed around a central detached flower stem. That means every one of these bulbs is plantable. They're all good size for planting. Soft necks have a papery neck. There's no hard flower stem coming out of them, and you can stuff that stem right down on top of the cloves. And when you break a soft neck garlic open, you've got a pretty solid mass that is composed of, first on the outside edges, a lot of bigger cloves. But then as you work towards the center, progressively smaller and smaller cloves. And often at the very end, you have a central mass like this that's directly attached to the main root stem. But there's actually like 3 or 4 bulbs in there, or 3 or 4 cloves in there. These small center cloves, we seldom bother planting. If you really want to try to stretch your amount of seed garlic you got, you can, but often they result in smaller finished bulbs at harvest next year. You can plant all the larger individual cloves from around the outside. So that means there's some that at the end that you can just throw in and eat instead of planting if you like. So hardnecks, large cloves, rich flavors. Lots of good varieties to play with. It's quite a kick actually to try the different flavors. They tend towards a warmer garlic flavor. Rojas or Spanish Rojas are famous for that. Chestnut Reds, a nice northwestern variety. German Reds, Music, one of the new varieties. One of the other things you'll notice about hardnecks though is that they're super easy to peel when you're using them in cooking. So soft necks, the paper is pretty hard adhered to the clove itself. But in hard necks, if you take the flat of your blade of your knife or the handle of your knife and you crush it down against a hard surface, they crack open and the paper just peels right off. So they're actually easier to peel and work this way. Soft neck, there's also a lot of great varieties. Most varieties will do okay here. Feel free to play around. We do recommend you buy certified seed garlic, not just saving your own garlic and not just buying organic garlic at the store. The reason why is primarily disease prevention. Alliums are subject to a whole batch of potential disease problems. Those problems can get into your soil, and then those problems, like white mold, are relatively permanent in the soil. You get a good dose of white mold growing in your soil, you may not be able to grow garlic or onions there for 10 plus years. You can't get rid of that disease. So buy certified seed garlic to avoid that problem. There's also other factors in there like known generation, how far out they've been cloned, because that makes a difference in how true they are to the name type and such. So some good varieties in soft necks. I do a lot of early Italian myself, although it tends to be a slightly smaller bulb. Inchellium, which is what you get here, is a phenomenal soft neck to work with. Nutka Rose, another good one. Silver Whites. So lots of fun varieties to play with. The overall yield is slightly higher because there's more bulbs per clove, or cloves per bulb, I should say. And the storage is definitely much longer. And then elephant garlic is usually just sold as elephant garlic. I've never seen any named varieties of it. Good yield because of the bulb size, but very mild flavors. And elephant garlic bulbs, for comparison, and these are actually relatively small elephant garlic cloves for planting compared to a traditional garlic clove. There's a pretty substantial size differential there. Okay, so once you figure out how much garlic and what varieties to plant, now you need to get them in the ground. And now is the time, fall. So 1 pound of garlic, approximately 20 to 25 row feet, yielding 7 to 8 pounds. First step, clear the space. You've probably got some crops in there, or you just got them out. You might have a little bit of weeds growing up now that the rain has come in. You might have thrown some cover crop out earlier and it's come up. Garlic and onions are intolerant of competition. You need to make sure you get all of that plant material out of there. Any crop residues, like left over from the tomatoes or from whole crops, leaf crops, get them out of the area as part of the preparation. Then you want to prep the planting area. Usually we plant in either long single rows or blocks of several shorter rows. And so you want to, even though you may have gardened this spot over the summer, you still need to refresh it. Get some fresh compost in it, get it turned, get it broken up really well. They do need a reasonably fine soil for good success. I usually use an enriched compost like the Harvest Supreme for planting mine. Get that thoroughly worked. Your planting furrows or your rows should be about 6 inches deep, and they should be well separated. So you're going to be planting these plants something like 8 inches apart in the row, 6 to 8 inches apart in the row. But it's a good idea to leave a foot or a little more between rows to allow adequate space for them to develop and to get enough nutrition and water. Fertilize right in the row before you put the garlic in. I mentioned that before, they're kind of hungry. We use a traditional vegetable food, granular organic vegetable food for that. It is an option that I do some years and don't others, but you might consider it to put just a sprinkling of dusting sulfur into the furrow as well. It should deter some of the rot organisms that sometimes happen from winter plantings. Also might pick up your flavors a bit. The flavor components of garlic are sulfur compounds, so having a little extra sulfur in can help a little. Yes?
Ammonium sulfate?
Ammonium sulfate is fine within limits. The problem with ammonium sulfate is it's there and then it's gone, and it's really, really hot, so you have to be careful not to overdo. But that is an option, yes. So when you're ready, got your furrows ready, go ahead and separate all the cloves out of the bulb. And like I say, for a hard necks, you can probably plant them all. Soft necks, you'll have a few of the interiors. They're probably not really worth planting. You separate them all. You figure out what your hand span is or get a ruler out. 6 inches apart is really minimal. 8 inches apart is a bit overkill for most traditional garlics. For elephant garlic, you want to be around 8. Anywhere around 4 or 5 inches deep, which means if you've got a 6-inch furrow, the garlic is really just sitting on the top of the furrow and you're covering it over at that 4 or 5 inches. They are distinct. If you get lost in there once you've got them separated out, you can kind of see where the roots come out from the base end. There's a little bit of a callus where that is. When in doubt, they got a pointy end. Pointy end goes up. Easy to tell which way to orient them. So we've got that row furrowed out, got your fertilizer in, got a little maybe a little sulfur in, plant those 4 or 5, 6 inches deep, 6 inches apart, maybe 8 inches apart for elephant garlic. 12 inches apart is minimum. At 12 inches apart, they are a mass. They're actually hard to dig. 18 inches is considered a more standard spacing for garlic, as far as between rows. And then take that soil that you've dug out of that furrow and you've mixed with compost and all, and use that to just come back over the top. It's a good idea to reserve a little compost and put a decent mulch layer on top. Garlic actually benefits nicely from a mulch layer. As I mentioned at the outset, planting time is normally now, September, October. Plant November, plant December, no problems. January is often tough weather-wise to do any planting, but you can. February, you're starting to impact your yield pretty substantially. 1st of March, I normally would say you're really past planting garlic and having any real success. So you've got some time to work with there. There's often also not much available past the initial shipment of enough garlic. So the garlic will grow and will sprout and grow fall and into winter. And they'll emerge in a matter of weeks. And the deeper you plant them, the slower they are to emerge. I've started planting mine a little bit deeper because it's giving me larger bulb size. But the trade-off is it takes them quite a bit longer to break soil surface. And I'm always out there wondering if I messed something up this year and didn't get my garlic up. So have patience. They will get there. We use the granular organic fertilizers. One thing you should know about granular organic fertilizers is that their function, their ability for plants to use them, is dramatically impacted by soil temperatures, by the soil microbial activity. So we do that at planting, but as the sprouts are pushing up out of the soil, we often like to give them a little bit extra fertilizer. They are hungry, but the granular organic isn't really going to do any good in late November, early December. You can use a bit of a liquid fertilizer with fish emulsion. Again, focus towards nitrogen. 5-5-1-1, something like that. 4-2-3s are fine too, but focus a little bit more towards the nitrogen end of the spectrum. These liquid fertilizers, even in the organic ones, they can use right away because they're already in a soluble form. The plants can absorb them. And so then they'll grow really slowly over the winter. Um, Optional trick, if you don't mind throwing some money at having something a little different in the garden, you can plant your garlic about twice as dense, say 2 to 3 inches apart. And you can go through after if they sprouted and through the fall and early winter, you can actually harvest green garlic. It's kind of like green onions, but it has a more of a distinctive garlicky flavor. It's kind of a fun thing to do. It just takes the extra amount of garlic to make it work, so you're not sacrificing your whole bulb yield in terms of green garlic. Usually, about a couple of weeks after solstice, those things get so hard on the hard stem garlics, hardneck garlics, that you can't use them as greens anymore. So that's kind of your switch over. But so they're growing slowly, continuously over the winter. Just like all overwintered crops, you'll notice sometime in early to mid-February, all of a sudden they're starting to grow again. We got the day length is picking back up, soil temperatures are slowly increasing. It's a good idea to give them another dose of the liquid fertilizer then. Again, soil temperatures are still pretty low for the granular organics. And then in March, I will usually do a final application of a granular organic fertilizer, just side dressed alongside the rows. That will take them all the way through harvest in roughly June to July, depending on variety. So very important over the winter and over the spring to make sure that you keep the weeds out of the garlic patch because they're taking necessary nutrition, but they're also occupying soil space where you want those bulbs to be filling in. They are not tolerant of competition. So keep them well weeded through the winter and through the spring. Some years we dry out pretty fast, pretty hard, as early as late April. And so you should have some plan in place to irrigate them if we are so dry that early in the season. They're not a particularly thirsty crop. They can be dry garden, but you'll get better yields if you can water them if they need it. So some garlic, particularly true of pretty much all the hardnecks, will set a flower scape sometime, usually April to May. You start seeing those scapes come out. You can remove them. It's fine. You can saute them, stir fry them, make all kinds of things, fun things to do with them. You can leave them on. They're really not impacting your plant much. If you were to do acres of garlic and you took half of it and you took the scapes off and you took the other half and you didn't, you might notice a very small increase in yield where you took the scapes off, but it's tiny for the home gardener. It's not usually worth worrying about that small of an increase in yield. Sometime early to midsummer, we're talking June into early July, you'll notice that despite irrigation, despite fertilization, they're starting to yellow. The progression will be yellowing from the oldest, most basal leaves, working its way up the stems. This is a sign that they are finishing. You should immediately stop watering them. At that point, you've got probably 2 to 3 to maybe 4 weeks to harvest. You can let them continue to slowly yellow up the stems. You don't have to wait till the entire thing is yellow or dried out. In fact, it's probably not a good idea on garlic to wait quite that long. When the last 2 or 3 leaves on the top are still green, the rest of it's pretty well yellowed down, it's a good time to get them out of the ground. Get them out relatively gently. Garden fork or shovel, start way outside the row, turn them gently so you're not tearing them up too bad. Don't wash them. Don't try to take the dirt off of them. If you stopped watering like you should have, they should be dirty but not mucky, right? You need to get them out of the ground, need to haul them someplace where they can be in good air circulation and not completely full sun so that they can cure. It takes them about 3 weeks before they're actually ready to eat from that point. For me, this is my garage. No direct sun. I can spread out sheets of cardboard. I can spread them out on sheets of cardboard and just leave them like that for the 2 or 3 weeks until they're ready to finish processing. So don't trim the roots, don't trim the tops, don't try to wash them. Just get them spread out, let them cure. After that curing period, now you can go through and finish up the processing. So this is go ahead and trim the tops off, or for soft necks, you might want to wet the tops so they're pliable again and braid them. Go ahead and trim the roots back to just little fringer roots so they're not a cloddy mess. And if they're really dirty, you can take a moment and very gently with your hands just kind of rub the outer layer of paper off. You should have several layers of paper around each of these bulbs. One or two layers off to take the worst of the dirt off for storage is just fine. Just don't strip them clear back to the inner paper. The more paper you leave on, the better your potential storage. Hardnecks, I get about 3 months out of hardnecks usually, sometimes 4. Usually I don't plant enough hardnecks that I need more than 3 months to get through them. Softnecks can store 10, 11, maybe 12 months. In practice, I find that usually about April in mine, they are beginning to sprout out pretty heavily, and they're starting to decline in quality pretty heavily. So I usually don't quite make it to June, July for the next harvest cycle, but close, very close. Questions at this point on garlic?
You have all those varieties in the store?
I have 80% of those varieties I listed in the store right now, but not quite all. I mentioned a couple others that are classics that people are familiar with, but may not be in store this year because we do rotate our varieties year over year. Yes.
Dumb question, but the little bulb that you planted, what part of the new garlic is that?
So when you plant them, they root out there, and that's the central crown mass, and you get bulbils that produce around it as an exterior. So it's interior, but it's gone by the time you're harvesting. It depletes all its energy pretty rapidly into shoot elongation.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's the center shoot. That's what it is.
The mother.
I'm sorry, I had one other, it was
Yeah.
on curing, so when you're saying like, you're harvesting and then. I've seen a number of different ways, some people just lay the entire plant out on top if it's dry.
So when we're talking about curing these and spreading them out, your criteria are you want to spread them out enough for good air circulation, so you're not creating any trapped moisture that's going to cause rot organisms to develop in. Leaving them out in the full sun can shrivel. If you got a shady location, they can lay on ground if it's dry. Decks, patios are great. I say my garage is convenient because I know it's safe from critters as well as direct sunlight, and it's nice and warm. That garage heats up several degrees warmer than the house interior, so it's still warm but not in direct sun.
Okay. And we leave the all the plant intact.
I leave the plant intact at least the first 2 to 3 weeks for curing. You will see some different opinions on that, but that's resulted in the best overall storage capability in my experience working with it. Okay, onions. Onions can also be a super high yielding crop. They are a little more temperamental than garlic. They're not particularly super difficult, but there's just more things that can go wrong with the onion crop. One of the funny things about onions is, despite the fact that they're day length regulated and they'll always harvest at basically the same time, there's lots of different methods or modes and timing opportunities for planting. So it's not as simple as buy your garlic bulbs in the fall and plant them. You have options, and there's pros and cons to each direction. So bulb forming onions are different from bunching onions or greens onions because we're actually intentionally trying to produce an onion bulb. Bunching onions are easy. You do them pretty much any time of the year just for green onions, right? Bulb forming onions are categorized by how they respond to day length. So short day onions are like 10 to 12 hours of daylight and they start onion setting. This is what you grow south of the Mason-Dixon line in the southern US. They don't ripen right here because they don't have enough growing season to size before that day length criteria is met, and they start trying to set the bulb. So you get little tiny bulbs or no bulbs at all. Long day onions require more than 14 hours of sunlight of daylight for bulb initiation. 14 to 16 is kind of the usual assumption at that point. These are varieties like Walla Walla Sweets, for a good example. And so they do really good in the Northwest and in the northern hemisphere, northern part of the country. Intermediate days are kind of different. They typically are a 12 to 14 hour day. You can grow intermediate days here. We seldom get really big onions out of intermediate day, but they give you some interesting variety selections, some that are have some of the sweetness of the sweets, but with some of the storage capability of storage onions. So some balancing out there. Then besides the day length, they are usually separated out into sweet onions and storage onions. Sweet onions have high sugar content, but typically a limited ability to store, usually just a few months or a few weeks to a couple of months. Storage onions are the classic kind of hotter onion, but you do have the ability then to store them for many, many months for long-term use. When you're looking at buying onions, you'll find things like Walla Walla is classically listed. Run away from Vidalias, Texas yellows, those kinds of things. Those are short day onions, even though they're sweets. They won't grow here. They're not the right onions for us. Storage onions from bulb sets, like these, may not even be labeled as to what variety they are. We get them in bulk from growers who are handling them. They don't bother even labeling them necessarily. The typical ones we see might be Yellow Rock. That's what these are. Ebenezer Whites, Weatherfield Reds. But often they're just simply labeled as yellow, red, or white onion sets. Those are all storage onions. On the other hand, there are plenty of storage varieties that are named. They're just usually not done in the bulb set like this. So varieties like Patterson is a particular, or Copra are particularly good storage onions that are done from seed or seedling. Basically, you can plant onions several different ways. You can direct seed onions. For intermediate day onions, you can do that late winter. For long day onions, you're definitely ahead to do that in the summer before. So this is like a July, August planting for June, July harvest the next year. So 200 plus day to production cycle. If you don't want to direct sow them, and it's a pain to direct sow in the summer because you got to keep them wet during the germination cycle, you can often buy commercially prepared seedling trays. And that's certainly a fine way to plant a lot of these varieties and to have more variety selection than we can get from sets or other methods. Bunches are available in a very narrow window of time. Bunches are usually available from about the second week of February, give or take, through maybe the second week of March. And what they are is they're literally people planted onions out in nice, easily harvestable sand beds the summer before. They grew them on, and then in midwinter, they dig those out, prep them, and ship them out to the nurseries for you to buy. So they've taken care of that part of their growing step for you. And now you have these nice uniform bunches ready to plant, and they plant really easy. Really one of the better ways to handle onions. Or sets like this, which are only available for a small range of storage varieties. And they are available now and can be planted from roughly September through roughly March with varying degrees of yield. So if you are starting your own seedlings or you're direct sowing in the garden yourself, your timing on these is usually late July to early August, the hottest, driest part of the year. So watering is essential. Typically, your germination cycle is several weeks, 2 or 3 weeks anyway, before you see much germination. And they need to be evenly moist during that period. So that means maybe on top of any automated irrigation, you might be out there hand watering once or twice a day on top of regular irrigation to make sure they're not drying out in between. If you're direct sowing in the ground, you want to put about 3 to 4 seeds per inch because you're going to have spotty and erratic germination. Ultimately, you're going to then thin those down to 3 to 4 inches apart once you've got 8 to 10 weeks under them. You've got some size on them. You can do same thing in the cell packs, 4 or 5 seeds in a cell pack, and typically they're ready to plant out. They're 3 to 4 inches tall in about 8 weeks, ready to transplant out. Direct sowing I've done as early as the end of January on the spring cycle, but that's pretty dicey on onions. February, if you're going to direct sow for spring sowings, is fine for intermediate day or bunching onions, for example. Transplants can be planted pretty much anytime they're ready. So you can plant them September if they're ready at September. You can plant them October, November, December. January, again, kind of hard to work the ground. Transplanting onion starts in January. In January is fine. They're cold hardy. Getting germination is the challenge. February and March again. The earlier the better. These are still going to limit how big they get by how early you get them in the ground. If you're starting your own, plan 6 to 8 weeks from seed to planned transplant. Sets are probably the easiest way to do onions because they're just simple, straightforward, just like planting garlic. There's very little that can go seriously wrong. But because they were handled a specific way and then dried out and stored for shipping, they do tend to have a little more chance of bolting or having other irregularities in growth. So there's some trade-offs to that ease. Again, storage sets like this can only be done with storage onions. You can't do this with sweet onions. They don't form this kind of bulb that we can then transplant. So it's only a few varieties that are available. When you're selecting sets, definitely pick by firmness. Don't worry too much about paper or lack of paper on the sets, but they shouldn't have much give to them. They should have just a tiny bit of flex to them and no softness. They typically, any obvious sunken areas or shriveling is a sign that they're less likely to be successful. It's not uncommon if you're doing some later plantings to have a little bit of green sprout out the tip of the onion, and that's just fine. Just like with garlic, a pound of onion sets will plant something around 20, maybe 25 row feet. Your basic preparation doesn't really change with mode of planting. You got to make sure that the ground is clear of all plant debris, clear of all weeds, cover crops, and other things like that. You got to amend the soil with plenty of compost, get it nice and loose, and not too cloggy if you're working in the dry part of the season. The furrow needs to be half the depth of garlic. You're planting onions a lot shallower, so you're making only about a 3-inch furrow to plant into. And again, put a granular fertilizer in them right away. Sulfur does not benefit you with onions typically. You can plant sets or bunches kind of the same way at different times. So with sets, you're going to plant those about 3, maybe 4 inches apart in the furrow. And if you've got your furrow at 3 inches, that puts you just about 1 inch over the top of the bulb. And that's a good depth to be at, 1 to maybe 2 inches below soil level. Bunches are a little harder to learn, and I simply don't have any to show you because it's not the right time of year. But basically what you need to know about those is they're green and they're brown and white. That brown and white is the papery sheath, the stem sheath, and that stem sheath should never be buried. So when you're putting those out in your furrow, you still want to go 3 to 4 inches apart or so, but you should be showing a little bit of that papery sheath above the soil surface, a little bit of that browny white above the soil surface when you're done. Regardless of which method from there, you want to then go ahead and fill in, tamp down lightly. It is okay to lightly mulch with compost, especially with sets. With bunches, be really careful. You don't want to get anything up over the top of that paper. That will create rot issues down in the center of the stem. It's a little different. With transplants, your best bet, once you've got your soil prep done, is to separate the seedlings from the seedling tray. You don't need to go down to, in fact, I would urge you not to try to go down to separating out to every individual plant out of a seed tray, especially some of these commercial trays where they put 12 to a seedling tray, to cell pack or whatever. Tease them apart in bunches of 2 or 3 or 4 is fine. If you're having trouble, if they're a little overgrown, get a little bucket of water out there and kind of soak them or even run them under gently running water as you're pulling them apart. You'll find it easier to separate them at that point. Typically, you'll be a little shallower with transplants because they're a little less depth to them. Again, you'll have a little bit of paper sheath on the top of them. You want to make sure that's still above soil level when you're done. So just like with garlic, sets planted in the fall will grow fall and winter. Good idea to feed again in the late fall with a liquid feed, and again in February with liquid feed, and then finish them off with a granular feed in March. Still keep them well weeded. They hate competition. They're a denser planting, however, than garlic is, so that does sometimes help a little bit. Spring plantings, obviously, you're not doing the liquid feeding. from a February feeding. If you start right off with one granular feeding right at planting, that will probably get you through harvest. If you find that they're not pushing fast enough, you're concerned they're not sizing well, go ahead and put that liquid feed on. It won't hurt them any, but kind of make that decision just a few weeks into the planting season, March or early April. See if they're developing well for you. Unlike garlic, onions have very little drought tolerance. They really don't do well dry. So consistency of watering in the spring will be very important if we dry down at all. They're very shallow with relatively small root systems. And unlike garlic, bolting is not a good thing in onions. Getting a flower stem out of them is a kind of a partial failure. There is no possible way you're going to stop all of your onions from bolting. It's a numbers game. Bolting happens. Why does bolting happen? Well, bolting is a plant's attempt to reach maturation and set viable seed before the plant is so stressed out that it dies, right? So things that reduce stress will reduce your bolting. What causes bolting then is poor nutrition, poor watering practices, or significant fluctuations. And that's probably the biggest thing. Even if we're not really hot and dry, or we're really not cold and wet, if we do a lot of bouncing back and forth between hot and cold or between wet and dry, that will tend to encourage more bolting to happen. This was a lousy year for me in my onions. I had a lot of bolting. A bolting is not a disaster, but a bolting means that that onion is once you start seeing that flower spike come out, that onion is not really going to develop anymore. And it's going to have a much less likelihood of being storable because unlike with garlic, that flower stem goes right through the center of the onion that you're trying to harvest and store, creating a green stem sheath that can then rot and create interior rots. So when they're starting to size up, you're starting to see some bolting, you can pick individual bolted onions out, use them right away. You can let them finish and see what you can salvage. Either approach works. Onions will push up. So when they're planted about 2 or 3 inches deep is all, as those bulbs start swelling up, they'll push right up out of the ground. Don't bury them. They don't want dirt around them that will lead to rot. Let them push up out of the ground. It's just perfectly fine. Just leave them like that. It's fine. If you do feel like you just have to mulch them because you can't stand it, mulch only up the sides of the bulb, never over the slope, the top slope of the bulb. And definitely not on the neck, or they will rot. Yes?
In watering, as they push out, can you induce rot by watering the paper? Should you water around the center, or is it fine?
It's okay to keep watering until you see the maturation. We'll hit that in just a second. But generally speaking, by the time you're pushing up that high, a lot of times it's about the time we are cutting off the water anyway. Yeah. Yes?
Is there any advantage to, because they're affected by fluctuations in moisture and temperature, tenting them?
Can be done. So tenting them for protection for humidity control and to change your temperature fluctuations can be done. We worry a bit about how much light you're cutting off. That would be the biggest limiting factor to that. Yeah. So once you've got them in and established, sometime around June, you'll start seeing them push up and you'll start seeing them get kind of floppy. Right? They don't need to be staked. You don't need to make them flop, but you'll see a significant droop over a significant portion of your planting. That's the time to stop water. And that's usually 2 to 3 weeks to harvest at that point. And if you withhold up water, that paper will be intact. You won't have the rot issues. If you had a perfect situation where your soil really dries out well and you don't have too many insect problems or other critters raiding, you can leave those onions sitting and just harvest as you want in very dry soil. There's enough risk to that I normally just go ahead and harvest them out and process them. My dad grows a lot of onions and in long rows of them, and he just typically leaves them in the ground and uses them and then digs out what he needs before the rains come in the fall. But there's losses that happen that way, particularly to insects and a few rodent problems. So, and I don't have the acreage of garden to take that risk myself. Again, gently dig, try not to bruise them. In many cases, in well-worked soil, it's not even a dig, it's just pull them out of the ground. They come right out. Don't worry about injury to the tops at that point. They're pretty well declining. They should still cure. Again, it takes about 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks to cure. There's pros and cons if the ones that have the flowers out, the bolted ones. If you cut them before you cure them, theoretically, they might cure back and dry back into the interior, and then you have a hollow in your onion, but it's a dry hollow. That's what I've taken to doing with mine that bulk, because it seems to give me a little better odds. If you leave just the green leaves on, that's fine, but 2 to 3 weeks when everything is shriveling, go ahead and then cut the greens, trim the roots. At that point in time, you can, again, just like with garlic, rub a layer or two of paper off to get the worst of the dirt off of them. But otherwise, try not to introduce moisture post-harvest. It tends to increase your rot problems. Moderate temperatures, dry and reasonably dark conditions. They're not potatoes, but if you put them in full sun, you'll find them greening up on you or bolting on you, or regrowing on you. The storage varieties can last maybe 10 or 11 months, theoretically. Sweets, they usually about 6 weeks out of something like a Walla Walla, which is why I don't grow a lot of them. The storage capability is pretty limited.
What's the best temperature to store them?
To be honest with you, I'd have to look that up again. Low end of room temperatures, so 50s and 60s is fine.
And in somewhere where they can breathe.
Breathable, yeah. Air circulation is much more important than temperature regulation. Yeah, they don't. That freezing will ruin them. Even a relatively brief freeze will ruin them. This is a problem for me sometimes in the winter because I keep them out in the garage, bringing a few inside. Garage is well insulated enough for the most part, but I do get some cold air under the garage door occasionally. We have one of those Arctic blasts in January. We're 12 degrees outside. I'll get right to 31, 32, where a lot of the crops are stored in the garage floor. So, and that will ruin them for sure. Yeah, so watch that end of it. So that's the basics on onion growing. You guys have any questions on onions?
I've got one.
Yes.
I took some green onions this summer and put them in the ground
Uh-huh.
and they got huge, but they never really made bulbs.
Yes.
They look like leeks or huge green onions.
Yeah.
And they're still in the ground. And I thought, would that be something that if they went the full year, would they get a big bulb maybe?
Bunching onions mostly don't. There are different types of onions, there's scallions and such. It depends because you can grow set onions for green onions and
That's
harvest
what I
them
was hoping they
green,
were, but
and then they'll bulb up. But generally, if you bought them as bunching onions, they're not going to form substantial bulbs. Some of them will multiply. You get a bulb and they'll set.
These are doing that.
Yeah, bulbils out. Yeah, and that's fine.
But they're not big. I
They-
mean,
yeah, they won't
the
get-
whole thing's big, but
Yeah, that's exactly what we'd expect out of that. So bunching in the sense of creating
Okay.
clusters too.
oh, okay, yeah.
Mhm. So I mentioned we'd hit very, very briefly on the other allium. So leeks are not really a bulb garlic or bulb allium. You're harvesting actually a stem piece. They're easily planted late spring, early summer, harvested in the winter, typically winter harvested in December and January. Super easy to grow, but require a lot of fertilization and quite a bit of water during the summer to grow. Shallots. The thing you should remember is that shallots are just like onions and just like garlic, slightly more like onions than garlic, but shallots are shallow like onions. You should plant them shallow. When I'm planting shallot bulbs out there, I'm usually leaving just the very tip of that shallot exposed or just barely covered because they rot in ground if you get them too deep. And shallots act, so they're shallow like onions, but they behave like a garlic. You plant one and they multiply around that central planting. And then so when you pluck them out in the summer, again, it's usually about June, you've got this cluster of shallots that you're harvesting. Other than that, all things are basically the same: consistency of moisture, reasonable fertilization. I find that in my super wet northeast Corvallis soil, shallots are a bit challenging unless I put them in a raised bed, where onions and garlic don't have that problem.